Welcome to Daily Devotions for Saturday, January 2nd, 2020. So we continue in our study of 1 Peter, verse by verse. We come today to verse 14 of chapter 1. As obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. So remember, we're beginning with chapter 1, verse 13, a response on the part of believers in light of all that Peter shared about our living hope through Christ. Now, in light of that, first of all, verse 13, set your hope on the grace that is to be brought to you when Jesus Christ is revealed. Verse 14, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. Two items here that are of significance. First of all, as obedient children, our lives of holiness, our lives of turning away from the desires of the world, they are rooted in our identity as children of God, our adoption as sons and daughters. On the basis of the fact that we are in a new family, we now take on new ways of living. And the way of living we take on now is not the way of ignorance when we were apart from God and living in our own way according to the evil desires of our hearts. Instead, we take on the family likeness. We begin to live according to the family policies, the way that God calls us to live. And so as obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. So the power for not conforming, not going with the flow of sinful desire, is found first and foremost in our identity as sons and daughters, our adoption as sons and daughters, and our union with Christ. And our hope in Christ, our future hope, also empowers our present obedience. Notice that the order here, the first truth that Peter calls us to is to set our minds on the hope. Then from setting our minds on the hope, then we as obedient children don't conform to the patterns of evil desire. It is hard. It is challenging to think in this way. We are tempted to just reach out for what is immediate, and that oftentimes is the way of ignorance, the way of destruction, the way of sin, the way that ultimately doesn't satisfy. It's the same issue, what we've been dealing with all along from the garden on. Short-term blessing, long-term pain versus short-term pain, long-term blessing. There's a principle of life that the delay of immediate gratification often works a greater good than the immediate gratification, which often has a very negative result. So we wrestle in that situation in our lives. This phrase here finds an affinity with Paul. Of course, do not conform. Remember Romans 12:2, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And that connects here with this verse, not only in the word conform, but also in the word ignorance. To live a life ignorant of God, turned away from Him, blinded to His truth, versus, as a Christian, living a life of renewal of the mind as we walk with Jesus. Our minds are renewed, and we are not conformed to this world, but we are transformed. So transformation is a much greater blessing than conformity. We desire transformation. Human beings want development, want a sense of movement, want a sense that we're progressing. We don't want to feel stuck or feel pushed into a mold. Ironically, teenagers a lot of times will try to stand out by their clothing or their appearance, and yet so often they're just falling into current fashion. So there's oftentimes ways where we think we're being transformative where really we're just conforming. Same thing applies to a person who throws off restraint, says, I'm going to do what I want to do, I'm going to be what I want to be. Most often they're just conforming to the sinful patterns of the world. So being transformed is a greater goal. And it is it's a more difficult path in some ways. I think Bunyan was right when he wrote The Pilgrim's Progress. This book, I think, is disturbing to a lot of contemporary Christians because the path is difficult. We believe in abundant life, and so abundant life means, well, we're just going to bound from one victory to another. Not the case. It's a hard path, and Jesus told us that, and Bunyan affirms it in his work, and we also need to recognize it in our lives, and yet keeping in mind the good goal, that heavenly inheritance, that current transformation. Those are good goals. So hope that's helpful to you today as we look at 1 Peter 1:14. We'll continue on in future days to look at this great book verse by verse. Have a good day.